Hello, we're going to talk about the history of Windows in this next online lecture. We're going to talk about Windows 1 to Windows 10, and it's important to know the history because, again, we're trying to get a fundamental understanding of Windows, and it helps to know the history of it to understand why things are the way they are. Also, it might help us predict the future as well. So let's get started. Microsoft and MS-DOS. So Microsoft was a very small company, started up famously by primarily Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who was able to sell to IBM, the giant company at the time, the unassailable giant with large market share and much respectability in the business community. The concept of an operating system for the new PCs that were coming out. IBM, for the longest time, made their money on mainframes and what was called mini computers. But PCs, personal computers, was a new market. To be honest, IBM didn't take it very seriously. It was kind of seen as a side hustle. So when they started producing PCs, they didn't really have an operating system for it because they didn't want to put any of their business class operating systems on there. So Microsoft came along and convinced them to put MS-DOS on there. It's one of the most famous business deals because it allowed Microsoft to have the financial platform to go on to do the things it does. And so anyway, they convinced IBM to pay them a software license every time they put MS-DOS. MS-DOS, of course, was based off of DOS, which was not even an operating system originally built by Microsoft. It was purchased from a separate developer in Seattle, which stands for Disk Operating System. It was kind of a very lightweight, very efficient operating system, command line only. We'll be talking a little bit about DOS. I can actually bring it up here. Let me just CMD. There is DOS. This is a command line as we call it nowadays, but this is essentially what DOS is. You can move around different directories by typing CD. I put CD like this. I go back to the root. I can CD into, let's say, users. There I am. I'm now in users. ls, I'm sorry, I'm not in Linux. I do a dir directory, it lists the directory, so forth and so on, right? So this is essentially DOS. All right. Anyway, long story short, Microsoft's able to make some money on selling DOS. They bought DOS and then they sell it to IBM. IBM puts it on all their early personal computers. The GUI interface of desktops was not invented by Apple, not invented by Microsoft, although they'd come to dominate the market. It was actually paid for, the research was paid for by Xerox, again, another massive company in the business world that paid for computer scientists to, the next big thing in computers. So these computer scientists worked and toiled away, and they came up with concepts like the mouse, the cursor. Well, they didn't come up with the concepts, they implemented the concepts of like a mouse and a pointer, and double clicking and clicking. And so when they showed the big bosses of Xerox, the big bosses of Xerox didn't get it. They kind of just scratched their head and they didn't think it was that impressive of a development. So when Apple and Microsoft come along and say, hey, can we take a look at what you've done? Xerox essentially gives it to them away for free. They say, yeah, these are, you can take these ideas. They're no big deal. It's not going to be a huge moneymaker for us. So Microsoft and Apple steal the early development of GUI. They both break off in their own way, and Microsoft starts developing Interface Manager in 1983. They finally released what was called Windows 1. Interface Manager was the original name for it. The ad wizards got a hold of it and called it Windows instead. So the early version, here you go. Let's get a link. And there it is. There's Windows 1.0. Here's an example of its desktop. Here's Notepad. Okay. Very rudimentary, one window at a time, rather famously, had very limited multitasking. One of the core concepts that we're going to get back to is the fact that early Windows is built on top of DOS. Essentially, it's a pretty picture on top of DOS. They're still running on top of DOS. And DOS, for any old timer like myself, can tell you DOS was not very good at memory management. It was actually rather bad at it. I can't tell you how many times in my childhood playing around with high mem and low mem so I can play Wing Commander. So DOS was really bad at memory management, and so you have this graphical operating system which is built on top of DOS, which was again very good for its time, but very limiting in what it can do. So anyway, 87 they released Windows 2. It has better memory management. Right away they bump into memory management issues, but still clunky. 1990 we have Windows 3.0, which is a major success. It has better graphics, primarily because they settled a lawsuit with Apple. Apple sued Microsoft saying, hey, you stole these ideas about GUI from us. And of course, Microsoft wins the court case by simply saying, no, we both stole it from Xerox. So it has virtual memory, which we'll talk about. I think we've talked a little bit before, essentially where we can use a hard drive as memory, which allowed it to do multitasking much better. And Microsoft was, again, this is the thing that launched and really gets the not just the foot in the door, but the whole shoulder and arm into the door of the operating system market. Was Windows 3.0 and 3.1 later on. So Microsoft does not end support until 2001. It was kind of a matter of pride for Microsoft. They had a lot of pride in that operating system. So by this time in the early 90s, IBM has come to see that they got the bad end of this deal, right? They always thought if there was money to be made in personal computers, which they doubted anyway, but if there was money to be made in personal computers, it'd be in the hardware, not in the software. And as Microsoft built a huge company, primarily, by releasing Windows and Office products, was a huge moneymaker for Microsoft, and personal computers kept showing up in the business office, or in the corporate offices, and the mainframe business was starting to shrink a little bit. IBM started to see the writing on the wall that they made a major mistake. So they actually went to Microsoft and said, listen, why don't we work together and develop a new kernel? Okay, so let me get the concept of a kernel here, right? So DOS has its own kernel. Linux has its own kernel, famously. It's the Linux kernel. The kernel is the core operating system. It is the actual code of the operating system, the very middle of the operating system. Okay, again, Windows at this point, Windows 3.0, is running on DOS's kernel, right? It's running on top of DOS. Okay, so like Linux, for example, you got Windows X, you have GNOME, you have different desktops. They run on top of a Linux kernel. Okay, it's that Linux kernel that allows all this graphical interface to be run. So Microsoft kind of sees the writing on the wall that DOS doesn't have long legs. It won't last very long as far as being the core kernel. So, and IBM sees this, I guess, as well. So anyway, IBM comes to Microsoft and says, well, why don't we develop a kernel together? And they agree. They work for a short time, and then they split off their own separate ways. It didn't last. But they took that kernel and it got, on the Microsoft side, it became NT, which is short for new technology, the NT kernel. Okay, and then on the IBM side, they had this operating system called OS2. Again, old folks like me will tell you the IBM's rather pathetic attempt of storming that castle, where they put it out into the marketplace. Warp OS, Warp OS2. It was a huge failure. So it wasn't a bad operating system at all. It just didn't do well commercially. So Microsoft and IBM started together working on a new kernel. Microsoft comes up with the NT kernel, which will become a massive part of our story, and then IBM came up with OS2, which will completely disappear from our story and be a side note in history, unfortunately. So. Windows comes out with Windows for Workgroups. This has allowed some networking. You can actually share files between multiple computers. That, again, was a huge deal. Networking was just a relatively new concept. In the meantime, they had Windows NT 3.1. So Windows NT was built on top of the NT server, okay, on the NT kernel. Okay, it becomes essentially their server platform. Okay, so you're starting to see Microsoft split into two groups. We have a desktop platform, which is still their Windows 3.1, or Windows for Workgroups. And then you have your Windows NT 3.1, which can get confusing. And then that gets replaced by Windows NT 4.0, which was a massive success. Novell was on a losing retreat from that point forward. Novell was the popular network operating system up until that time. And Windows NT 4.0 came out. So we had, even though there's an NT workstation, it was for high, it wasn't really meant to be the primary desktop operating system. Okay, NT started, and the reasons why are because the NT kernel is much better at memory management than the DOS kernel. The NT kernel used a different file system, which we'll talk about later in this course. NTFS, which allowed for much greater security. And NT in general was just more stable of a kernel, less apt for crashing and blue screens of death, memory errors, again because of memory mismanagement. And so NT was a much more stable and efficient kernel than the DOS kernel. However, that being said, the Windows operating system was very popular, and Microsoft kept it as the desktop, and that's going to get cemented in real soon. So when you start seeing Windows NT come out as the server and Windows as the desktop, okay, so you're starting to see a hard divide in the world of Microsoft. All right, Windows 95 comes out. It is again, all the Windows were GUI OSs, but Microsoft. Windows 95 becomes the GUI OS. It's what people expect the desktop to be, to look like. Up until this point, Windows 3.1 versus Apple, it was a legitimate fight. It was a close run fight. Windows 95 blows Apple out of the water. So much so that certainly in the desktop world, Apple has yet to recover. All right. So Windows 95 is a huge success. But that success is a bit binding, okay? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. They're a little trapped by it, right? You become a prisoner of your own success sometimes. It's hard to get away what's always worked in the past. Which, again, cements as if Windows 95 was built on top of DOS. It was using the DOS kernel. So I think the writing was on the wall for Microsoft as well, that this DOS kernel was a problem and they needed to get away with it. So we have Windows 98 comes out, which is essentially a prettier version of 95 that was quote-unquote internet ready. It had a browser built in, some dial-up services built in, but essentially it was just 95 rehashed. All right. Everything comes to a head in 2000 when Windows 2000, which is NT5 by the way, comes out. And Windows ME also comes out. Windows ME was short for Millennium Edition. Windows ME is built on top of DOS. It's almost like building this huge mansion on top of a bunker, perhaps, but a simple brick house. That's what DOS was, right? It was a simple brick house, wasn't very flexible, but it did what it needed to do. And then you decide to build this very pretty McMansion on top of it. That McMansion is going to be very unstable. And that's what Windows Millennium Edition was. It was a very pretty picture built on top of DOS, but really all the shortcomings of DOS came to fruition. Also, it's also training Microsoft users. And again, this is not so much Microsoft's problem, it was an industry problem where security was a second concern. It was intuitiveness of operating systems was much more important. going up to this time, and pretty operating systems were more important, believe it or not. So people just didn't take security very seriously, probably because up to this point there wasn't as much money on the internet, right? It wasn't the internet security and digital security wasn't considered paramount to success of our the economic futures of our country, which nowadays it is. So if you put yourself in that mindset, security was really the second most important thing. So anyway, it's training. So anyway, the fact that DOS has no security system built on their file system, it's using FAT32 at this time. It's really creating some bad habits with Windows users. They expect to write to the entire hard drive. They don't have to worry about if they're in as an administrative user or a standard user. All these become serious issues. All right. Windows 2000 gets released at the same time. Windows 2000. It was really probably should have been the time when Microsoft switched over to the NT kernel as their primary kernel. Windows NT 2000 desktop or workstation was a very good operating system. It probably didn't have as much support for games, especially the older games, the legacy games, but it was a very good operating system. Anyway, so long story short, you have this fight for the soul of the company. Is it going to be a marketing company? Is it here to give the users what they want, or is it here to make the best technology and force or trick the users or get the users to implement that technology? And you see really come to head here because Windows ME is a disaster. They release it, it crashes constantly. I was in IT at that time in my life, so I can confirm it was a constantly crashing, and most IT departments didn't switch over to it. Also, this is the start of the wives' tale of the Microsoft. I say wives' tale as saying, just a common mythos that's propagated in common culture, where Microsoft has one good release and one bad release. All right. So anyway, Windows ME is certainly a bad release. It was an abomination. Windows 2000 was actually a pretty good operating system, although it was very limited what it could do because, again, it wasn't really primarily built for everyday users. So in 2001, in rather a panic, Microsoft releases Windows XP. It's running on the NT kernel. Okay, it's NT kernel 5.1. It's a true 32-bit operating system. We talked about that. It used 32-bit processors. So it was taking in the word size was 32 bits, so it was taking 32 bits at a time. There's actually plans to start migrating XP to 64-bit. There's some support for it in the operating system. They're not going to really get to it, but it's there. There are multiple editions. There's home and professional. I mention this because it's really the first time you see this, where you have a home version and a professional difference. A professional, which is, again, we'll talk about what that really means. It's the longest running flagship OS at Microsoft, 2001 to 2007. It is a success by all means, right? It starts pushing out the NT kernel. They made sure Windows XP was as intuitive as possible. They made it look just like Windows 95, except for a little bit prettier picture, a glowing green start bar. It was one of the longest running flagship operating systems in MS history. It's a huge success. However, the one glaring error was security. Security was terrible. And part of this was to make it as easy as possible for, again, intuitiveness versus security, right? We wanted to make this as easy for the user to migrate over. Security was a disaster. And Microsoft learned that quickly. The reason why botnets got so huge in the mid-2000s was because of Windows XP. Windows XP it was so easy to get a bot installed on and a lot of people didn't have firewalls in their homes. It was Windows XP was a well-exploited operating system. Okay, so security was a huge problem. We have Microsoft servers on the side, by the way, 2003, 2008, 2012, 12 R2, 2016 R2, and then the latest one will be 2019. Point is, there's a hard wall now being built. They're both built on the NT kernel, by the way, right? This is the 2003 is built on NT kernel 5.2. So you have desktops being released under the Windows line, and Microsoft servers with a year after it usually being released as servers. Different packages, same kernel, okay, but different packages, okay. So now it gets into the controversial part. I am a supporter of Windows Vista. Windows Vista was an ambitious operating system. It was an ambitious failure. People malign it a little too aggressively. The big thing Vista started pushing out was two things. Number one was security. And number two was trying to migrate to 64-bit, and it suffered for both of those. We're going to see this with software architecture when we talk about this, but moving particularly drivers over to 64-bit and requiring a 64-bit operating system and making the jump from 32 to 64 was a big deal, and it caused stability issues. It caused software issues, and Vista suffered for it. It was probably a little too pretty. The operating system probably in hindsight was built to be prettier than it was efficient. So it ran slow on a lot of old hardware or older hardware, not fast hardware, I should say, for the time. And of course, security. Now you have a culture change. You're pushing a culture change to users so they compute more securely. They would get prompted. Windows Vista pushes out what's called AUC, which we'll talk about when we talk about security, which is access user control, or UAC, user access control, excuse me. So it pushes, it's going to start pushing out security to these users. And again, it wasn't well liked. And it was actually used against it in ad campaigns for Apple, the fact that it was being more secure. But it had to be done. And it paves the way for Windows 7. Windows 7, to be honest, was just Vista built for a little bit more efficiency, just a little bit, the bolts a little bit tighter, shall I say. Okay, and more time for the migration from 32 to 64 get switched over. Windows 7 is a huge success. It's well liked. Again, propagating this mythos in which, Microsoft had XP, which is fantastic. Vista, ooh, I hate Vista. 7, right? So I don't like 7. So 8 was in trouble when it came out because people expected it to be bad. And this is where we get to talk about the future a little bit. Windows 8 had Metro, which is a kind of a version of what we get nowadays. It introduced live tiles. It introduced, here are the live tiles. It introduced live tiles. There's some of my kids, by the way. It would take up the whole screen. Now, the whole reason why they have this Metro and these live tiles is because it works well in a mobile operating system. All right. Microsoft learned from its own rise that it doesn't want to be IBM. It doesn't want to poo-poo a market, especially a growing market. And mobile phones are that growing market. And they are currently not in the foreseeable future will not have any kind of foothold in the mobile market, in the mobile operating system market. Okay, Apple has a stronghold, and Android has even a bigger stronghold. Long story short, Windows 8 was supposed to be a operating system that could work on mobile devices as well as desktops. That's where the Metro screens come. Now, interestingly, too, again, talking about success that binds your hand, you mess with the start bar, right? The start bar is Windows. That's, by the way, before Windows 95, there was no start bar, right? So to mess with the start menu was a huge deal to users, and they got angry about it, right? So when Microsoft kind of compromised, and by the way, that was probably the biggest dig on Windows 8. There were some efficiency issues, but you're going to have that with a lot of operating systems. It did eat up a little bit more memory than Microsoft probably should have planned for. It had a harder time running, and people just, again, were already set against it because Microsoft has a bad operating system after new operating system. Other than Metro, there aren't a whole lot of complaints. you'll hear people complain about stability, but I think that's probably down to bad hardware. But anyway, so Microsoft compromises Windows 8.1, in which they do essentially what we're used to now, which is a half compromise, where it's part Metro and part old school menu. And then of course Windows 10 gets released. So let's talk about Windows 10 and the various additions. That's the important part out of this whole section. But keep this in mind: going back to some things that people dislike about Windows 10, Windows 8, and Windows 8.1 is that it's seemingly built for the mobile market as much as the desktop market, and that's true. And again, this comes down to Microsoft is going to, like, you're going to hear me complain throughout this course about I prefer control panel more than settings. I dislike settings. But settings is better built for mobiles, better built for touchscreens, and therefore they're going to continue to migrate more and more to settings, more and more settings that you need to change will be in settings and not in control panel. Okay, control panel will essentially be more and more responsibilities will be taken away from control panel to the point where control panel will just be this old man in the corner that we all ignore. All right, that's the plan, and I know why they're doing it, and it makes sense, right? They're trying to get into an emerging market. They don't want to be the next IBM. All right, so they're willing to leverage their success in a huge market where they make a huge profit, desktop market, in order to keep attacking that wall. They're going to keep attacking that wall, like Lancelot with his sword out, right? He's just going to keep swinging his sword against the wall. But they're going to do that because it's an emerging market. They don't want to be an IBM. They don't want to discount a market until it's too late, which maybe perhaps they did. But anyway, so we'll see that throughout the semester. Let's talk about the Windows 10 editions. All right, so we have 32-bit and 64-bit. So it does still support, Windows 10 still supports 32-bit. It's extremely limited. You're only allowed to have 4 gigs of RAM. A 64-bit can have up to 2048 gigs of RAM. That's less if you have a home device, if it's Windows 10 Home. We're going to talk about home versus professional. That's what we're doing here, and versus education and enterprise. We have this thing called fast startup with Hyperboot and Instant Go. All right, Hyperboot is essentially let me correct myself. It's Hyperboot. Hyperboot. Hyperboot is a way in which Microsoft shuts down and starts up. So what happens is when Microsoft shuts down, and we haven't talked about suspension yet, but we will. What it does is it closes all your applications, logs the user off, shuts all the user processes down, but doesn't shut down the kernel. It doesn't take it completely out of memory. What it does is it suspends it. It makes an image of that kernel in memory and then saves it onto the hard drive. That's faster because instead of reloading the kernel up, the process of rebuilding the operating system line of code by line of code, it just takes a picture of that image, it just takes that image, it doesn't take a picture, but that image is a picture. It just takes that picture and it slaps it right into memory. Okay, it's like a copy function. All right, so it helps the boot up process. Some people dislike this, probably old fuddy-duddies like myself. I do have a nasty habit of shutting down my machine using the command line, in which I can bypass Hyperboot. But if you, Hyperboot, what it does is it's actually putting your machine in an extreme version of hibernation. Just the kernel, not the apps, okay? That way it boots up faster. That's the purpose. An Instant Go is a form of hibernation. So if your machine goes into hibernation, true hibernation, again, it's a little awkward because we haven't talked about hibernation yet, but if your machine goes into hibernation, it keeps the network processes alive in the background so you can still communicate with the operating system through the network, in a nutshell. All right. It has Cortana, which is the voice interaction, so you can interact with audio and voice. Continuum is a system in which it works with mobile devices. It's specifically built for mobile devices to allow power management and those various things. Microsoft Edge, which is the browser. MS Passport, which allows for multi-factor authentication and uses the TPM chip, which we'll talk, Trusted Platform Module, which is a chip that does encryption and holds on to keys, so it's very important for security. MS Passport is a security feature that allows for multi-factor authentication. In other words, authentication that can be done with two different. When we talk about factors in the security industry, what we're talking about, like what you are, or who you are, what you know, where you are, that kind of thing. It allows for that kind of two-factor authentication. You have a password and a biometric type thing. Device encryption, again, that's primarily for you can actually do encryption on the hard drive. That's EFS, which is encrypted files system. Always on VPN is available, in which you have a VPN that's configured to grab any traffic destined to a certain area and send it through a VPN service. We'll talk more about that when we talk about VPNs. Features. So let's talk about what Windows 10 Home has. Everything I just listed. All operating systems have these features. Windows 10 has those features. That's it, and an easy upgrade to the other ones. Okay. So what does Professional have over Home Edition? Well, Professional can join a domain. That's a big deal, right? Professional. If you're going to have machines log onto a domain, make sure you buy Windows 10 Professional. Okay. Group policy management. We'll talk about group policies a little bit later in the course. Remote desktop is built into it. In other words, I can go out and I can remotely go into other people's desktops. Hyper-V client, enterprise mode, Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer is still available on Professional for backwards compatibility. A lot of companies rotated over to HTML-based web interfaces for their servers, and need Internet Explorer to work properly, so they have backward compatible Internet Explorer there. Azure Active Directory, which is the cloud-based Active Directory service. Windows Store for business, so if you're a large enough business, you can have your own Windows Store. BitLocker, which is a system we'll talk about under security, which allows you to encrypt your hard drive. It encrypts and decrypts on the fly, so that way once your machine shuts down or you go into hibernation, if someone takes your hard drive out, the entire hard drive is encrypted. They can't get to it. Windows Update for Business. It's an update service. We'll have to talk about updates and branches a little bit. So it's a Windows Update for Business, and then we have Current Branch for Business as well. So your book gets into this. Let's talk about, we'll wait until we get to long-term service branching at the end of this slide, and we'll talk about that for a little bit. So what does Windows Enterprise and Education have over Professional? Everything, and also App Locker is built into it. App Locker is a system in which you can block certain applications from running. Branch Cache, which allows you to cache up certain files. This is meant for branch offices. That way they don't have to download it every single time through your internet link and eating up bandwidth. Windows to Go, which is you can create a USB that creates a bootable version of Windows on a USB, which is fun to play with, and long-term servicing branch. So let's talk about branches. So to make this as easy as possible, let me just say this. The best way to understand branching comes down to adding new features and visual adjustments, alignment adjustments, little odds and end changes, okay? That's a branch, okay? Now you can run two different ways. You can run current branch, and there's a current branch for business. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But we have current branch, which, by the way, Home doesn't have a choice. Home has to run current branch. In other words, if Microsoft, the October update, for example, or the October update. So it made changes to Windows, little odds and end changes, where certain things were located, certain options, little changes to the taskbar, That's going to get pushed out to Windows Home users, and they have very little they can do about it. All right. So that's current branch. There's also current branch for business, like right here for Windows Professional, in which you can vet it for a little while. You're going to get the current branch every 4 to 6 months, and you can essentially vet it and check it. It gives you a little bit more time, because if you change things on your users, you're going to get calls and help desk. So hopefully IT is on top of that. And then finally, there's long-term servicing branch, okay, which education doesn't have, by the way. So long-term servicing branch runs much like the old way Windows would do, that all the features and changes to the operating system would it would be optional, and it would happen every couple of years, right? It'd be almost like a service pack is the way to look at it. It would and you could wait for that couple of years until Microsoft finally forces you to do it, to actually do it. Again, this is all part of Microsoft's effort to get Windows on the same page. That was a problem in previous versions of Windows, where a lot of companies were holding off a long time pushing out, especially aesthetic choices or realignment choices, or new features, or and so people, there was a lot of confusion out there whether or not it was a standard feature or not a standard feature. So again, a branch is kind of the feature set and the look and feel of Windows. You have current branch, which means you get forced upon you. Current branch for business, which allows you, gives you 2 to 4 months to kind of work it out first. And then long-term servicing branch, which is essentially you're going to treat almost like service packs to get to the latest version. They'll build up during that time period, and then all of a sudden you can switch over to the new system. So that's only available to enterprise. All right. Let's talk about Windows 10 Mobile. Windows 10 Mobile has BitLocker, just like everyone else but Home. Home does not have BitLocker, by the way. Pre-installed Office apps, so there's some Office apps already built into mobile. And Enterprise Data Protection, which is a system in which you can mark certain data as being critical. Again, this is all stuff that would be great on tablets, or more so phones, and they would hope people install on their phones, which they don't. There's also Windows IoT, which is Internet of Things. It's a very scaled down version of Windows. It's meant to run on IoT devices. We have Windows S, which might be the future. If I ask people what the most secure operating system there is out there, the answer usually comes back Chromebook. And part of the reason why is because anything installed on Chromebook has to be installed through the App Store, through Android's App Store, or not Android, but through Google's App Store, or Google Play. Okay, that allows them to vet all the software. All the system files can be checked on the internet to make sure any change is a bad thing, right? There's what the Chrome operating system files look like should be the same on every single device across the entire spectrum. Windows certainly does not have that freedom. Very few files on Windows looks the same across all versions of all editions of Windows 10. Windows S is going to try to be something, from what we can tell in the industry, is going to be something more like Chromebook. Okay, you can only grab apps, you can only install apps from the Microsoft Store. No more EXEs, no oddball programs, that kind of thing. If you do want to run oddball stuff, then you can host it on a server and run it through I'm sure the Edge browser, right? You want to be able to install Chrome. I don't think you can get Chrome through the Microsoft Store. It does have BitLocker as well, but essentially it's primarily built right now for lower end machines, and you're going to see that. But this is kind of we'll call it a web-based operating system, web-based version of Windows. That's what Windows S is, and that might be a future its own kind of pathway for Windows in the future. There's also Windows N and K. Those are special windows built for the Korean market, which I think is Netherlands, but it's a Windows version of Windows, a European version of Windows. Those versions are built for specific countries that have sued Windows for being too much of a monopoly, so they have to remove certain features in order to comply to court rulings. And that is it. Those are the settings. Those are the additions of Windows. Know that if you want to join a domain, that professional is you're going to have to go professional or higher. And know that BitLocker is available on professional above as well. And Windows S is limited to what it can install. It can only install from the MS Store. So there you have it. There's a little bit of where we were and where we're going with Windows, Windows 10 at least. And I'll talk to you later.